Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on the closed beta of For Honor. This is the upcoming hack-and-slash action game developed by Ubisoft, and it's coming to PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4 on February 14th. So it's a bit over 2 weeks out, which means that I don't think there's going to be very many major changes between this build and the full retail release. So this is a pretty decent idea of how the game is going to be on launch. I'm not really going to talk too much about the presentation other than it does look better than the previous versions. They put in more of the special effects, they put in more weather effects, that sort of thing. And that's definitely much appreciated considering that the previous builds were a bit static. They also introduced the Viking faction into the game in its entirety, so now it's not just knights versus samurai as far as the minions go. Instead, you get all three of the factions as it is intended, and the Vikings definitely fit in pretty well with all of the other artwork that you see for the various other minions. So it's definitely nice that they've updated it in this particular build, and it also ends up looking pretty good, but they also improved the sound overall as well. You've got the same sound effects, you've got the same music, but they messed around with the voices now, so that you get the actual voices of the various characters instead of just a bunch of grunting and yelling. So for example, a lot of the time when the knights are swinging their swords around or doing particular moves, then they might yell out in something that sounds like Italian. Now I don't speak Italian, so I can't verify if it actually is Italian, but it sounds like it. The samurai, of course, yell out Japanese phrases, and the Vikings yell out what I'm assuming is Norwegian. Or at the very least, that's what they're intending with it, and it all ends up adding quite a bit to the sound design of the game overall. It definitely makes things a lot more interesting than just a bunch of grunting and yelling, but other than that, they didn't really update the presentation all that much. It still looks like a pretty decent game for the current gen. It's nothing particularly amazing in the visual department, other than the simple fact that they put a lot of detail into the art assets. Thing is, you're not really going to care so much about the presentation, you're going to care more about what they did with the gameplay, and more importantly, the technical side of things. Because that is the major sticking point with a beta this close to release: technical problems. And that is the one thing this beta has been absolutely plagued by. There have been numerous server problems since the beta launched, and in fact, I didn't get to play the beta at all for a period of right around 20 hours where it was trying to sort out the server problems, which was pretty ridiculous, quite honestly. This close to release, they should have had serious problems like that ironed out, but instead, we were running into instances where it was just stuck in infinite loading screens where it would not load anything in, and we're not entirely sure why. There's a bunch of "a network error occurred" pop-ups that come up and kick you back to the main menu, and basically the only fix for that is just to restart the game. People will regularly get kicked out of groups for no discernible reason. People will regularly disconnect from matches for no discernible reason. There will be constant host migrations. Yes, it runs on peer-to-peer and matchmaking, and yes, it is laggy as hell a lot of the time. So Ubisoft needs to get their crap together and actually put in a dedicated server system instead of just relying on peer-to-peer and matchmaking, because I thought we would have pretty conclusively proven by this point that peer-to-peer and matchmaking is an objectively inferior system to dedicated servers and a server browser and or matchmaking. But apparently there's no plans to put in dedicated servers right now. And go figure, that's the one thing people are complaining about the most, the fact that it is peer-to-peer and matchmaking, and the peer-to-peer makes it laggy as hell. In a game this centered around skill and timing, you can't have lag problems. And yet, lag problems absolutely plague it. That's on top of the disconnection issues and the various master server problems. Not to mention issues where you'll get stuck on ladders for no discernible reason until somebody comes along to whack you upside the head and suddenly you're falling off to your doom. But here's the thing, a lot of bugs can be fixed. The stuff about the ladders, you can easily fix that. Graphical glitches and sound glitches and such like that, yeah sure, fix that no problem. You can even improve some of the netcode before launch. What I don't think they can do is put in a dedicated server system, because they would have had to plan that out for quite a while in advance. It's not so much a coding issue as a logistics issue, and I just don't think they can manage that before launch unless they've been planning for it for some time and just haven't told us. But I'd like to reiterate that the game was effectively unplayable the first day of the beta. On the second day of the beta, it is finally playable, but it's still plagued by a bunch of problems, mostly related to the peer-to-peer system. And the sad part is, once you manage to dig through the rather large amount of technical problems, there's actually a rather good game underneath all that. The closed beta brings us pretty much everything that we saw in the alpha version, but they've changed up a fair few things. In fact, they've made the assassin classes a lot more skill-based this time around. In the alpha version, the deflect move was incredibly easy to do, so pretty much everybody played the Orochi and it just absolutely dominated matches. When you move on into the closed beta, they changed the way the deflect works, so now that instead of just having to time your block just right to manage to hit the deflect, you now have to dodge into the enemy's attack at just the right time. That is a rather narrow time frame, and if you don't do it in the exact amount of time, you're just going to dodge over to the side, and either you will just dodge the attack, or you'll dodge too early and it'll hit you anyway. This adds a considerably higher degree of skill required to play the assassin characters than it was in the previous builds, where admittedly it was fairly easy to play the Orochi. Now it takes some time and dedication to be able to learn how to properly play the assassin classes, and they're a lot more situational. They are considerably weaker in multiple enemy engagements now than they used to be. And that's saying something considering that they were pretty weak in those engagements to begin with. So overall, while I did complain about that change to begin with, once I got used to it, it actually ended up making the assassin classes a lot more rewarding to play. They also introduced the Knight's assassin class, which is the Peacekeeper. It's a female-only character that wields a sword in one hand and a dagger in the other. And she actually quickly became the character that replaced the Orochi for me. It's not that I don't play Orochi anymore, it's that I just tend to play Peacekeeper a lot more, simply because I much prefer her moveset. Thing is that the Peacekeeper is a pretty hard class to play well, so you need to know what you're doing with it, and you need to be really good at the timings required to get deflects in and such like that. Thus you get that really nice risk-reward thing going on. There's also two additional classes that weren't in the previous builds. Those are the Nobushi, which is a samurai that's also a female-only character, and she's also interesting because she's the only hybrid class that's available in the closed beta. You have your vanguards, which are kind of all-around characters. You have your heavies, which are slow and lumbering, but they're very high defense. They're very hard to take down. You have your assassin characters, which rely a lot on counterattacking and deflecting and things like that, but they're very high risk reward, even though they're kind of squishy. And then you have the hybrids, which are the Lawbringer, the Valkyrie, and the Nobushi. And they all wield polearms. Specifically, the Nobushi wields a Naginata, the Valkyrie wields a spear, and the Lawbringer wields a halberd. And they represent an interesting mix of the various playstyles that are available. The Nobushi is a pretty light and maneuverable character that is capable of some pretty long-range poking attacks. The thing is that a lot of her attacks rely on applying the bleed effect, which means that it just does damage over time. And the Nobushi is unique in that when you apply bleed effects on enemies as the Nobushi, your attacks actually end up doing more damage to them after that bleed effect has been applied. And while I'm really not very good with the Nobushi, a lot of the footage that you're seeing in this is me playing as the Nobushi, and I actually ended up liking that character quite a lot. It's an interesting playstyle. It's one that I didn't quite expect when I had gone through the other classes as well. You may think that the additional range might make the Nobushi overpowered, but you really do have to know what you're doing with a Nobushi to be really effective with them. Similarly, you also need to know what you're doing to play as the new Warlord class. It's a Viking class that wields a sword and a shield, and his entire thing, because it's a male-only class, is that he can basically negate enemies' attacks. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that when he goes to swing, if he times the swing just right, it will effectively deflect the enemy's attack and then do damage to the enemy. Similarly, he can time his heavy attacks just right so that he'll still take damage, but he will hit you as well, and it does quite a lot of damage with this guy. And really the only thing that balances him out is that you have to get that timing down pretty much perfectly, otherwise it's really not going to work very well. But if you have those timings down, then the Warlord is pretty much overpowered right now. And the worst part is that the way he's set up, I'm really not sure there's a way to balance him out, because if you tried to balance him out any other way, then it basically removed that special ability that he has. He'd ultimately be that one class that nobody picks because the Conqueror would be ultimately superior. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with him in the future, if they manage to balance him out pretty well in the long run. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see on that. But even with the slight balancing issues here and there, what you've ultimately got is a combat system that works really well. It's a lot more like a fighting game than it is just a plain old hack and slash game. Sure, there's the obvious parallels of the special moves that you can do as well as the various combos that you can do, but there's also that idea of the mind games, where you can just kind of play with your opponent's head a bit and try to mislead your opponent into letting their guard down just long enough for you to get that sword strike in. The problem is, like it was in the previous builds, this is not built for anything but 1v1 combat. 2v1 sometimes you can get away with. Anything more than 2v1 and you are just doomed. And I don't really think words are sufficient to express how incredibly infuriating it can be when the entire enemy team gangs up on one person and just annihilates that person within a few seconds. Sure, at this point you could argue, well, you're supposed to be working as a team, but the problem is that even if you're working as a team, there's only 4v4 on the absolute highest player count that you get. The other two modes available are Brawl, which is 2v2, and Duel, which is 1v1, and those are considerably more optimized for the combat system. Dominion is of course an objective-based mode where you're trying to control various points, but even with that particular emphasis, you will regularly see entire enemy teams going up against single guys just to annihilate them and then move on to the next area to basically just be as cheap as possible. Admittedly, a lot of that is a player issue where people just do not fight with honor and thus they will just gang up on people in order to win. But the thing is, the game pretty much encourages it, because anyone who's going up against more than a single opponent is a complete sitting duck. They try to compensate for this with the revenge mechanic, where as you do defensive actions or take damage, your revenge meter builds up, and once it's built up all the way, then you can trigger revenge mode, and that can knock enemies down if you time it right. But it mostly exists to give you a bit of extra health and damage resistance, as well as make your own attacks do a bit more damage. But that's really not enough to compensate for more than, say, 2v1 or at extreme cases 3v1. About the best you can hope for in those situations is that you can hold the enemy off long enough for your teammates to get there, but the thing is, that relies on your team actually playing as a team and not just kind of running around like headless chickens. Admittedly, that's a player problem more than it is a game problem, but it's still a problem. One that won't be fixed by the time the game launches, because that's really a people problem and not a problem with the actual game so much. But the takeaway is that the core gameplay is definitely solid. It's there, it just needs some fine-tuning to be really great. But what's ultimately going to absolutely demolish this thing is the technical side of things, particularly with the peer-to-peer and the matchmaking. If they put in dedicated servers, that would fix a lot of the lag problems and the disconnection problems that people are having. But whether or not they're going to actually listen to us and do that is entirely unclear. Hopefully they wise up and actually put in the dedicated servers and make it a proper multiplayer experience. Because what you've got there, like I said, is a rather solid foundation that just needs some fine-tuning to be great in terms of raw mechanics. But without solid networking architecture, it's pretty much all for naught. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see on this. I am still going to review this as soon as I can. I probably won't review it during Requests Month because I'm going to try to focus all of my efforts on the Requests Month videos instead of doing other things as well. But if I manage to get further on the video production for Request Month than I thought I would, then I may sneak it into Request Month as well. If not, then expect it in very early March. But until that time, let's just say I'm very cautiously optimistic about this. Because like I said, solid foundation, but they really need to sort out the networking problems and the other technical issues that this thing has in order to get something great on their hands. Thanks for watching.